Doctors, nurses of Reddit, what was the creepiest last words you heard from a patient right before they died? I don't care that I'm not a nurse, but this was said by my dad to the nurse, so close enough. Backstory: Dad had manuscript. He'd had it since he was 18. Diagnosed at 20, married my mom at 24, had me at 29, died 15 days short of 45. 6 months before that, he was put on hospice. He and mom were discussing funeral arrangements, and my mom jokingly said, "You know Tim, the best thing you could do would be to die on a Wednesday. That way we can have the body prepared on Thursday, the viewing on Friday, and the memorial on Saturday, so more people could come." Point the morning we got the call that it was time, my mom, 2 sisters, and I were about 5 minutes too late. After we said our goodbyes, the nurse pulled my mom aside and asked if that day had any significance. It's not even 6 AM yet, so mom doesn't even know what day it is, much less if it's important. The nurse tells her it's May 21st. No, nothing is coming to mind. The nurse told her that the previous day he kept asking what day it was, and they'd tell him it was the 20th. He'd look irritated but accept it. That morning, he asked what day it was, and they said, "It's Wednesday, May 21st. He smiled, squeezed his favorite nurse's hand, and was gone almost immediately. It was Memorial Day weekend, and we did just as he and mom had planned. And despite many friends being out of town for the holiday, we had over 250 people show up at the memorial service, overflowing the tiny church more than it had ever been filled. To his dying day, he was trying to make things easier for our family. I miss him." All of my family members who have died with people nearby to watch them pass have talked about seeing people in the room with us. Usually they talk about long past family members. Honestly, I find it more comforting than anything else. My grandma was the most recent. She talked about seeing her 2 children that she outlived. One died when she was 7, the other was my uncle who died last year. Then her eyes lit up, and she had a big smile, and said to the air, "You've grown." And my uncle, not the dead one obviously, asked her who she was talking to. She gave him the name that he and his wife had picked for a child they had who was stillborn. My grandpa on the same side of the family was having conversations with his long dead brothers, then smiled, and his last words were, "I see Jesus." Personally, I'm religious, so I like to think that things are actually happening that we can't see. But even if I'm wrong, and it is just your brain shutting down, how comforting is it to think that as you pass you'll see, or could see, all the people you love coming to welcome you home, even if it is just a hallucination. I think it's the best you could have. I'm working on my mother's eulogy for tomorrow's wake. I'm going to go into detail for anyone that is smoking, because I think it's something you should reconsider. My mom was diagnosed with terminal lung and pancreatic cancer. Mass had developed around her vocal cords and made it hard for her to speak. She smoked all of her life, and it finally caught up with her. It attacked her quick. From time she was diagnosed to time she passed away, it was less than 2 weeks. First she lost her voice, then she had difficulty breathing, became weak, she couldn't walk too far, then she could only walk a little, then nothing at all. She had trouble eating. The night she died I let her smoke her cigarette. Doctor said it didn't matter anymore, and my sister and I took mom into her bed, and I knew, as did my sister, it was the last time. We spent a few hours with her, holding her, and I got up, lost it a bit, and my mom said, "Don't be sad," loudly with all her might. I was fortunate to be with my mother at that time. She was due to have hospice that Monday, but she did not make it. Lung cancer kills quickly. I hope none of you have to deal with that. Consider it that next cigarette. It's just a matter of time. Well, enough preaching. I live in the Pacific NW, and there was a rupture of the Olympic pipeline in Bellingham in 1999. The petroleum flowed into Whatcom Creek. There were 2 little boys playing in the creek behind one of their houses with a barbecue lighter. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the petroleum flowing into the creek was set on fire by the lighter they were playing with. It became a conflagration. We could see the thick black smoke pouring into the air from 25 miles away. From what I remember, one of the older brothers and a couple of his friends ran out to the creek behind their house and brought the boys out of the water. The little guys were severely burnt, but in shock, and with adrenaline running, didn't realize how hurt they were. I still cry when I think about it to this day. When I read that the little guys thought that they had caused the explosion from playing in the creek with a lighter. Worse, and this actually haunts me, is one of the boys telling the rescuers that, oh, my mom is going to be so mad that I ruined my new clothes. These little guys died the next day of their burns. It was an unbearable account. Ugh. I was a hospice nurse for many years. Super gratifying job for a nurse, surprisingly. As a regular nurse, you are rarely offered thanks. Hospice nursing is an island unto itself. Mostly peaceful, lots of times sad, often a blessing point. This is sad, but also creepy, and I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it. Had a 20-year-old kid, gang member, who was dying of primary liver cancer. Super unusual, aggressive, and terminal. He was angry at the universe. His family was there to comfort him, but he literally spit in their faces. Every ounce of energy he had left was angry, and mean and ugly. His mom would beg him to lighten up, and accept Jesus into his heart. He would swing at her, and tell her to F herself. The family remained beside, in hopes he would chill out at the end point. His last day, hours, moments, he was angry. The family called me into the room, and told me they thought he was going. He wasn't responding. Cheyne-Stokes breaths, eyes glossy and skin cold. The end was imminent. His lovely mother, in her dearest attempt, whispered to him to go towards the light, to her Jesus. With his dying breath he opened his eyes, looked at her, and said, F your Jesus. A second or two later, he slowly turned his head to the left, and got the most horrific look on his face, as if he was looking at something we couldn't see, and horrified, like in a bad movie. His face contorted, and he screamed with his last breath, eyes wide, oh shit, oh, no, then made a guttural noise and promptly fell back into the bed and died. Every family member was shaking, and too frightened to speak, and I left the room, and took 2 days off. I don't care if I never find out what he saw. I may have told this one before. This is how I remember it. It was years ago. I was a junior resident. I didn't know the patient all that well, but got called up to get her paperwork ready for discharge. She was an otherwise healthy 96 or so, had a palliative colon resection for cancer, something. I went to her room to do a last wound check and see a JP drain, and she kept talking about how she was going home. To Bill, her son pointed out that she's usually mentally very sharp, but Bill was her husband who had died years ago. He reassured her, no, mom, dad is gone. We are just going back to the house. She insisted. No, I'm going to him. He came to see me this morning and said he's taking me home. Whatever, I guess. Son said she was otherwise at baseline. It was the first and only weird thing she said. Vitals and labs looked good. So we progressed along the DC pathway. Not even a few minutes later the code blue got called to her room. She was don't code, so we didn't do anything, but it was like, WTAF. I guess Bill really was coming for her. Her son was surprisingly okay with how this played out. This one chilled me for a while. Names changed to protect the innocent, and let's face it, it was like 10 years ago, and I don't remember anyway. 4th year MD student here. Haven't heard too many creepy things. A lot of the patients that are close to the end aren't in great talking shape. Not all of them, but most from my experience. Creepiest thing though. We had a guy in his early 70s who was just a train wreck of health problems. Normally a CAMS razor brings cause of death down to one worsening cause. This guy had metastatic melanoma, really bad multiple myeloma, lung cancer that had metastasized, 3 different cancers at the same time. He weighed maybe 80 lbs. Hear a code blow over the PA system and the whole team shows up. Chest compressions, epinephrine. We get a pulse back after 3 minutes or so. Guy's chest was destroyed by compressions. There was trouble getting a good line into the vein, so I think they drilled into his shin. Catastrophically painful if you're awake. Dude opens his eyes and looks around a bit. Looks scared as hell. Can't speak or really moved, but looked terrified. His nurse, standing in the corner for the whole time, pipes up, not sarcastically. He told me he was DNR. The family put the legal stuff in a folder on the chair. We pushed morphine and covered him up, redid his gown. I held his hand until the resident declared him. First death I ever saw. Dead people are cold, just really cold. No one had ever told me that point something somewhere went wrong and his computer file hadn't been updated. Only that nurse knew, because he and the family had told her. I cannot, to this day, think or understand why she didn't scream at anybody showing up in the room not to touch him, or at least look for the folder with his living will in it. She and whoever, doctor, nurse, secretary, whoever that screwed up that charting mistake should be raked over the coals. The family seemed pretty understanding of the mistake, but if they wanted a lawsuit, it would have been a deserved slam dunk. Never gonna forget the way he looked around though. I hope he was disoriented. That would be a horrible reality to have on your mind as you moved on. Point on a lighter note. Bumped into a kid from high school at the gas station years ago. We chatted for a couple minutes, and as he headed out his last words to me were, "We are going to the titty bar." Died as the unrestrained passenger in a car crash that night. He and his buddies were trying to catch air in a car by going over some hump in the road. Crashed into a retaining wall. He was a nice dude. Can't write this without sobbing, but 3 years ago my grandma passed. She was stubborn as she could be, and the hospice nurse kept telling us it won't be long now, anytime. So there were about 20 of us, her kids and grandkids, her 80-year-old sister, standing around the bed. It became quite uncomfortable, all of us just standing there holding hands waiting. So finally I went over to her and whispered in her ear that I loved her and it was okay for her to go. She and I were very close. After I did that, my mom did the same thing, then my grandma's sister. After another while my mom said, "I remember a long time ago, she told me she figured she would hear 'I'll Fly Away,' her favorite hymn, as she entered heaven's gates." Everyone kinda chuckled, and my 80-year-old great aunt a few minutes later softly started singing, "One glad morning, when this life is over, I'll fly away to a home on God's celestial shore, I'll fly away." And without missing a beat all of us joined in as best we could. We were all crying, "I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away." At the end of the verse of course we were all just sobbing. Not 10 seconds later did her heart stop forever. She just needed some help to fly away. Never got to share that before. Thanks. Not final words, but action point. I was a first year med student at the time, and as part of our clinical rotations they farmed us out to learn how to do history/physicals on whomever would agree to give up an hour of time to chat with somebody who clearly didn't know their ass from their elbow and wouldn't be able to help them with anything. So largely it was the chronics awaiting placement who agreed. I was interviewing an octogenarian status post-dynamic hip screw who was awaiting transfer to rehab. We were plodding through the checklist that comprised my review of systems at the time when he stopped mid-sentence and looked over my shoulder towards the door as though somebody had entered the room. I cast a quick glance to see who it was, but there was nobody there. I looked back and his gaze was fixed and his mouth was quivering slightly, and then he died. Boom. 1 second talking and the next dead. Massive pen. Saddle embolus. I don't think I've ever seen somebody die so suddenly since. And I reflect on that look. The specter of death had been right there, hovering over my left shoulder. I still think about the look in his eyes. He saw it, and he knew. Warning. Long post ahead. Point. My grandfather had always known when he was going to die. He always said that he was dying on May 26th at 12 in the afternoon. Point. Towards the end he kept telling us that his time was coming, that he was nearing the end of his life. The morning of May 26th he calls my dad at about 8 AM. They have about an hour-long conversation. No one knows details. My dad doesn't want to tell what they talked about. My dad says at 9 AM my grandfather said this: "I'm not feeling all that great. I'm going to go get a snack and take a nap. So I'll see you on the other side." An hour later we get a call from my grandfather's girlfriend. He died at 10 o'clock in his sleep after eating half a can of Pringles. About 5 years later my dad starts saying the same kind of stuff. He'd had really bad problems during this time, so he's not in the best health. He's always going on about how he know he's dying on October 10th. He goes on and on about it. That morning, October 10th, he says that he doesn't feel that good and that he doesn't want to do anything. Not typical for my dad. Well, he goes on through the day anyway. Later that day he has to go to a dinner party for work. Him and my mom are leaving, and he says to me, "Well, I'll see you in the other side. I love you." That night him and my mom get back, and he goes straight to bed, doesn't say anything to me or anyone. The rest is what my mom said happened that night. He was sitting in the edge of the bed in his pajamas mumbling to himself. I asked him what was wrong and all I can understand is that he has to use the bathroom. He got up, walked to the toilet, sat down, and fell over dead. All I saw was blood everywhere, and the only thing I could think was to call Thomas, my brother. A couple of minutes later my brother shows up and drags my dad through the house and out to the truck. There's blood everywhere, and my dad was dead. My brother drives home to the nearest hospital and is slapping my dad back to life. Throughout the 15-minute drive my dad dies 3 more times and my brother slaps him awake again. He was in ICU for 2 weeks. When he was healthy enough to be transferred he was moved to a bigger hospital, where they put a stent in his liver. That saved his life. He's completely fine now, but if we had waited for an ambulance, or if my brother hadn't been there my dad would have died that night, just like he said he would have. TLDR, my dad and grandfather were psychics. Quick backstory: I was 6 when my uncle was killed by a drunk driver, 10 when my best friend was killed by drunk driver, her father. Now to my mom, I was 15, she was dying of cancer at home. I was petrified of dying up till her death. So the day she dies I come home from school, my mom tells me this is it, go talk to her, while she makes phone calls to my uncle and aunt and my pop to come home, it's time. When I was with her she was normal, talking, joking, she hadn't been that way in a while. My mom comes back, and my mom is adamant that my mom has to go to store to get her whatever it was she wanted. My mom didn't want to leave, but she did for her. Mind you, my mom is home, not hospital. So out the window I see my mom heading to car as the rest of the family shows up. She was talking to us and everything. Then she goes to sleep. Deep sleep, not responsive but breathing. Now I look out the window, my mom is parking the car. My mom wakes up, but isn't looking at us. She sees something else. She calls out her brother's name with a shocked look on her face and moments later died in peace. The brother she called out to has been dead for years, but to watch her reaction made me believe there is an afterlife and people aren't alone. My mom comes walking up the steps as my mom took her last breath. I believe for some reason she didn't want my mom there. For me it made me believe in more, and to this day 21 years later I'm not afraid to die. I'm a CNA, but this isn't about a patient. My fiance's grandfather passed away back in January. When my fiancé and I got together I became responsible for helping his pop get to the doctor. He went into the hospital for various reasons and we were told he was in congestive heart failure and that this was the end. The hospital is an hour away from where we live and we both were working full time, so we were traveling back and forth. We slept in the truck in the parking lot one night, so we were the first ones to see him that morning. He was in ICU, so only 2 at a time could be in his room. He was still sleeping when we got in his room, so I pulled up a chair and laid my head down by his leg and went back to sleep. My fiancé went for coffee, and when he got back him and his pop started talking. Pop was in and out of it at this point, mostly singing old hymns and pleading for God to take him home. One of the last things I heard him say was, "You've got a good one here, don't let her go." He was rubbing the top of my head as he said it. I didn't grow up with grandparents, and he was the closest thing to a grandfather I had. The very last thing I heard him say was, "I love you, too." We made sure to tell him we loved him before leaving the room for anything, and he replied every time until he finally fell into a deep sleep and never woke again. God knows I miss that man. This will probably get buried, but oh well, maybe getting it out somewhere will help. I'm not a doc or nurse, but I lost my mom a few months ago from complications from COPD and heart failure. Her carbon dioxide levels were rising, and she was on comfort measures with morphine. She had been unresponsive for a bit, and my aunt and I were standing, one on each side of her hospital bed. One of the last things she ever asked was, "Why's everyone here? What's going on?" While looking into her sister's eyes. My aunt was a trooper though, and explained how we were trying to make her comfortable because her lungs weren't working anymore. She said, "Oh, okay," like that was the most sensible thing in the world. The only other thing she said after that was a little while later, she said he's waiting for me. We'd like to think it was maybe her dad or my aunt's husband who had died the year prior. Who knows? She was gone by 10 AM the next morning. Just whatever you do, let your loved ones know you care. My mom had reoccurring pneumonia, and we had been planning to get her into rehabilitation that week, and she was gone. Only 54 years old. So, make sure to share the love. I'm a nurse, but this story is one that a patient told to me. I promise, it's worth the read. She and her husband had an amazing love story. She was a shy German girl, and he was a US soldier in WWII. He and his buddies were out one night, and they found my patient and her friend walking down the road. The guys tried to pick them up, but they thought the boys were just trouble. So the girls told the boys to meet them in a certain spot in town later that night. The girls not only stood the soldiers up, but they watched them from afar. My patient ended up running into one of the soldiers again later, and he finally convinced her to take a chance with him. When he picked her up, he told her family that he was going to marry her someday. Shortly thereafter, he was sent back to the US. They wrote letters back and forth for the next few months. They became engaged via letter. He promised he would bring her back to Germany every year, a promise he kept except for 2001. Because of 9/11, it took a little over a year for her to be able to come to the States, where her future in-laws had helped get everything ready for the wedding. They finally got married, bought a farm, and stayed side by side for almost 60 years. She said they were never away from each other for more than 24 hours. Ever. They had children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. On their wedding anniversary, her husband woke up to go to the bathroom. He leaned over and said to her, "Happy anniversary, I love you," and gave her a kiss. When she woke back up in the morning, he had passed away. Listening to that sweet woman talk about their love and life together, and to hear about his passing, made me break down in tears in the middle of my shift. I will never forget it. Not a doctor/nurse story, but seems like a good place to share. I was previously married to a man who traveled quite a bit for work. He came home for Christmas, but was feeling quite ill over the holiday and nothing seemed to make him feel better. I'm not sure what came over me other than a feeling of impending doom, but I couldn't sleep the night before he had to leave again for a short 3-day work trip. I told him I was super worried someone around me, or even myself, was going to die, so I made him stay up to listen to whatever my final wishes were, and forced him to tell me his. We didn't have a will. The night before he was due back from his trip, I again had a very strange feeling come over me, and I decided to text him to apologize for any pain, any sadness I had ever caused him in our relationship, a rocky one. He texted back to tell me he had forgiven me long ago, and that he loved me. The next day, when he didn't return, I learned from a detective he passed shortly after our last messages. Those last messages prevented a lot of guilty feelings on my end, and brought a lot of comfort to me. Always trust your instincts, my friends, and tell those you love how much you love them. My grandpa told us that when we left his hospice room for the night, that his brother-in-law/best friend and other male relatives came to visit him. He told us that they were coming to get him, but he kept telling them not yet, and they'd be annoyed and give him one more day. He got away with 2 to 3 days because those relatives were pushovers. Somewhat happier story. During the daytime my mom and I went to visit my grandpa, and he was awake, but not 100% there. He kept pointing out into the hallway and asking my mom, "Are they over there?" And she was so confused. He looked at me, winked, and then used his pillow to pretend to be fishing, his favorite hobby, off the side of the bed I was sitting on. He looked at me and said, "Nope, not over here." Then went to my mom's side and did the same thing. When he pointed, my mom looked out the door to see what the heck he was going on about, and asked again what he was looking for. When she turned back to him, he hit her in the face with the pillow and laughed a huge genuine laugh and said, "Live bait." He was still very much himself to the very end, even if we didn't realize it originally. He told me as we were leaving that he was trying to cheer my mom up, and it worked. Not sure if it counts, but I was a field medic, kinda, for a while, and the circumstances are funky. taking care of one guy in this tent in the middle of butt-cheek swampland, and he looks up at me while I'm tending to him. He fell into fetid, muddy water after a few nasty hacks to the abdomen and shoulders a while before I arrived. Infected, smelled like death, and looked no better. He was AskReddit. Real making the way out easier kinda work. But anyway, so he spoke to me out ta nowhere. Rillin, right? Oh, yeah. Where are you from? A place called Sadrithmora, on the other side of the continent. Oh, it's pretty there, right? Pretty sunsets? Why yeah, they're really pretty. Good. I wanna see it someday. Then he died. I felt for the guy and buried him myself. Years later I'm back in Sadrithmora, and who do I see walking around? Him. Sounds like BS. Wish it was. Spitting image aside from his complexion. I try to ignore him, get real interested in the corner club by the road. He looks over at me and speaks. Sergio? Yeah, Sarah. It is a pretty sunset. Huh. Oh, yeah, I suppose it is. He winks and walks away. Haven't seen him / whatever the sheets since. Whenever I think of home I think of the sunsets, and him. Not a nurse or a doctor, but experienced my father's death. He was young, only 46 years old, and had been diagnosed with bile duct cancer. The process was excruciating, and it was heartbreaking to see my strong infallible hero succumb to the terrors of cancer. A year after his diagnosis he was put on hospice, and my stay-at-home mother attended to him regularly. The hospice nurse told us that hearing was the last thing to go. She had said this because he had become completely unresponsive for several days and we didn't really know how to react. We were told to keep talking to him and reading him comments from friends that had posted on Facebook, etc. It has been days that he hadn't moved. Other than closing his eyes to sleep, he was completely gone. Well, one day right before he died, the day before, I believe, we brought my then 18-month-old daughter into the room. He loved his little granddaughter more than anything. In that moment that we brought her in, he sat forward and put his arm out and around her like he was reaching for a hug. He muttered something unintelligible, but I knew he was calling out for her. He held her close for a few minutes and then passed the next morning in his sleep. I feel like he needed to see his granddaughter one last time. And now crying. Well, let's see. I'm a phlebotomist and I see every patient in the hospital, so I hope I can still reply despite not being a nurse yet, or a doctor. This little old lady was in the ICU but doing okay, alert, oriented, etc. She was on an insulin drip, so we had to check her glucoses every hour, on the hour. At 11 PM, I checked her glucose. She asked if I could get her in the chair instead of the bed. I asked her why, since it was so late. She told me that she knew she was going to die soon, and she didn't want to die in a hospital bed. I was like, okay, whatever. I told her I would tell the nurse. At her 12 AM glucose, a sheriff is in the room bagging up her body because she passed away 45 minutes ago. Another one, I guess. This patient was very close to death and we were still checking her labs because she was an organ donor. She had been very out of it all day, unresponsive vaginal respirations. Clear as crystal, she perked her head up and told me to turn the TV off because the angels didn't like watching this channel. I asked her what she meant and she said, those beautiful little angels standing right outside my window over there. They are ready for bed and don't want to watch this channel anymore. I told the nurse, and that patient died within the hour. Well, let's see. I'm a phlebotomist and I see every patient in the hospital, so I hope I can still reply despite not being a nurse yet, or a doctor. This little old lady was in the ICU but doing okay, alert, oriented, etc. She was on an insulin drip, so we had to check her glucoses every hour, on the hour. At 11 PM, I checked her glucose. She asked if I could get her in the chair instead of the bed. I asked her why, since it was so late. She told me that she knew she was going to die soon, and she didn't want to die in a hospital bed. I was like, okay, whatever. I told her I would tell the nurse. At her 12 AM glucose, a sheriff is in the room bagging up her body because she passed away 45 minutes ago. Another one, I guess. This patient was very close to death and we were still checking her labs because she was an organ donor. She had been very out of it all day, unresponsive vaginal respirations. Clear as crystal, she perked her head up and told me to turn the TV off because the angels didn't like watching this channel. I asked her what she meant and she said, "Those beautiful little angels standing right outside my window over there. They are ready for bed and don't want to watch this channel anymore." I told the nurse, and that patient died within the hour. I work direct care and I used to work at a rehab. A lady came in who was pretty different from the usual fodder. She was in her late 60s and addicted to pain medications from multiple hip surgeries a decade ago. I was assigned to check her in and show her around. She was a big trouble on everyone because she had a walker, so she needed a lot of help, plus her mind was obviously going because she was constantly convinced people were stealing her stuff. I was put on her almost every day because I was the only one she liked, so I could calm her down. She was racist as hell, but overall pretty nice, and I felt insanely bad for her. She was on a ton of meds keeping her alive, so weaning her off a pain med addiction was hard as hell for our med staff and I knew it. She had some sort of medical issue every day. Her organs were shot. She had been there about 2 weeks when she went into cardiac arrest. We had an RN on staff, but there's only so much we can do. I called 911. I stayed with her as they were preparing to put her on the ambulance and she grabbed at my hand very panicky. I told her it was okay and I'd see her back here soon enough. I knew it. She calmed a bit and told me those pills are the real devil. I wish I had just suffered through the pain. She died that evening and now I have a real aversion to pain meds.